these programs around the world now work because of a few allies who we encounter all over the world. And just listening to you, I was realizing you are truly one of those allies. It's just, I know Enseña Chile wouldn't be where it is without your incredible championship. So thank you. It's truly inspirational. I am so happy to be here in Chile. This is the second time I've been here. The first was, I think, a little over 2 years ago, and it's just been so inspirational. I've only been here for a few hours so far. But Tomas and his team and some of the teachers who have already completed their 2 years, just spending a few hours with them gives me, it's another great boost of inspiration because they believe so much based on everything they've seen that it's truly possible to change things here in Chile. I'm excited to have the chance to just share a bit about I guess, my story and what I've learned, not only in the United States, but now from colleagues all around the world. And what I've learned has essentially given me just a whole new level of both optimism and just urgency about what we and what you as the rising generation of leaders just have, honestly, I believe, a moral responsibility to take on. I started in this, as you heard, 22 years ago or so when I was a student in Princeton University. And I had become very focused on the problem of educational inequity in my country, in the United States. It's a country that aspires to be a place of equal opportunity and, claims to be one, and is in fact known around the world, by some at least, as being a place of equal opportunity. And yet the reality is that kids' life circumstances completely determine their educational outcomes and life outcomes in the United States. A fifth of the country's kids grow up below the poverty line, about 16 million kids. And only 8% of those kids will actually attain a college degree, compared to 80% of the top quartile, the top 25% from an income perspective of kids. So that's a huge disparity, 8%, 80%. And as an idealistic college student, I thought we should do something about that problem. We were known as the V generation. Supposedly all we wanted to do was go work for banks. And I just thought that label was misplaced, and that it wasn't the generation, but rather the fact that, that wasn't the problem, our generation, but rather the fact that all the recruiters were banks. And they were all, and consulting firms, and they were just banging down our doors asking us to commit 2 years to work in their firms. And one day I just thought, you know what, why aren't we being recruited as aggressively to commit 2 years to teach in our highest poverty communities? So that was the initial idea. Now, 20 years ago in the United States, the prevailing notion, based on all the research, was that there was no way to break the link between economic background and educational outcomes. When I was graduating from college, there was a movie called Stand and Deliver. I don't know if any of you, I don't know if this has been, does anyone in Chile ever heard of this movie? There was an actor, Edward James Olmos, who acted the character of a teacher named Jaime Escalante, who was a teacher in Los Angeles who taught very low-income kids, non-English speakers. And he coached them to attain the highest levels of math proficiency. And there was a movie made about this teacher because the testing company didn't believe the results. They were so extraordinary. So it was the story of this teacher who had overcome all odds and had coached, hundreds of kids to do well in math. And I remember my own reaction and the whole country's reaction in watching this movie which was to assume that it was a movie. You know, like, we made a hero out of this man, and we just assumed he was an outlier. No one thought, let's go figure out what did he do differently. Let's understand that and spread it. We just assumed you couldn't replicate it. So that was really the prevailing thought, just that this was a deeply intractable, impossible problem. The journey that I have been on over the last 20 years in the United States, and more recently in now 24 countries around the world, has led me and my colleagues to realize that actually we can solve this problem. I learned that from our teachers and ultimately alumni of these programs. It started, though, in the classrooms of some of our teachers, not all of them, but some of them figured out how to work with their kids in a way that would, in fact, put their kids on a trajectory to get the best education. So I think about some of the teachers in Teach for America's first decade, those top recent college graduates, people who didn't major in education, they were going to go to med school or to work in companies, but they said, fine, I'll teach for 2 years. I think about a woman named Aurora Laura. She was one of our early teachers. She taught 4th grade in Houston, Texas. And her kids came into her room reading on a 1st grade level and not even knowing to put spaces in between words. Like her kid, like 4th graders. So she's thinking, she herself had grown up in a low-income community, and she was just outraged when she met her 4th graders and realized they could not even read and couldn't write. And she heard other teachers say to her that her kids would never, like she heard them call her kids dumb. And she was just outraged. And she said, you know what, we're going to prove to this school. By the end of this year, every one of you will pass the 4th grade test and will be writing beautiful 5-paragraph persuasive essays, which is what you're supposed to do in 4th grade. And you'll be going into 5th grade on grade level. She sat down with the parents and the kids, and she told them, you're reading on the 1st grade level. It doesn't have to be that way. And if you work incredibly hard this year, you will get on a track to actually go to college. And she rewrote the whole curriculum and worked incredibly hard. And I honestly struggled a lot, but just kept persisting. And you would walk into her classroom and you would see a teacher on an absolute mission, like maximizing every second to move her kids forward. But she still realized there wasn't enough time to catch her kids up, so she started getting them to stay late. She got the key to the school building. She was teaching every Saturday, and all her kids were coming. And by the end of the year, all of her kids passed this test. So when you stop and think about this, what did she show us? Like this problem that we all think is intractable, she was 1 year out of college. And she went in and she showed us all that actually kids can do this. Like if we meet them with high expectations and extra supports, give them the extra time that they need, do whatever it takes, they can excel on an absolute scale. They can do just as well as the kids in the much more privileged communities. The thing though, you know, what we started realizing as we spent more and more time with teachers like Aurora, we realized it's a very rare person. Like she went to kind of super heroic lengths to accomplish what she did. And so a group of our alumni in different places started saying, we need to rethink our schools to make it more possible to actually get those same results. And they went off and started, they started a new kind of school. Most schools put learning opportunities in front of kids and they assume, right? Like some of the kids, like the bell curve, some kids will really get it and some will sort of get it, and others won't really get it. And that's the way it is. these schools said, no, our mission is going to be to ensure that every one of our kids gains the academic skills and the character strengths necessary to get to and through college. So I remember, actually again in Houston, Texas, these two guys named Mike and Chris, who each started separately 2 schools that were going to prove that they could take whole buildings full of kids who are growing up in poverty and get them on pace to get into the best. They were middle schools, the best high schools across the country. And sure enough, they got their kids into these boarding schools that only the most elite kids get into. So those were the first 2 models of this new kind of school. And if you go to the US right now, there are maybe 400 schools, more every year, that are proving in dozens and dozens of communities across the country that we can change kids' trajectories. Like, these schools are showing us that it's possible. There's nothing magic about the schools. They have a different mission. There's always a school leader who's just absolutely determined to make that happen, who builds a strong team and a strong culture and lengthens the school day and does whatever it takes. But the conversation in the United States is totally different now than it was 20 years ago. Because how can, you know, I think about a place like, actually take New York City, which is a big school system. And 15 years ago, there wasn't one school that was showing that you could provide a building of high poverty kids with an excellent education. Today there are 40. And next school year, there'll probably be 50. And once you have that many schools proving what's possible, you realize, wow, so we can really do this. It does, you know, we might not be able to have every kid taught by a superhero teacher, but actually these schools are showing that it's possible for talented, committed teachers to actually produce transformational results for kids. So the conversation now is, how do we create whole communities of schools that provide all of our kids growing up in poverty with an excellent education? And we have a long way to go to get to the point where we have whole communities like that. But if we went back even just 10 years ago in the United States, people had given up on our urban areas. They didn't think it would be humanly possible. Think about New York City with 1.1 million kids. All anyone can say is we need to break up the school system. It's too big. We'll never fix the school system. But a decade later, 4th graders are a whole year ahead of where they were 10 years ago. And the graduation rate among the African American and Latino kids is up 20 points. New Orleans, Louisiana, was always viewed as kind of the case study of a deeply entrenched urban area where nothing would ever change. And there was a big hurricane in New Orleans like 6 years ago, and it became this kind of common knowledge that, wow, things are really broken in New Orleans because there was so much television attention on New Orleans. 8th graders in New Orleans were reading on a 2nd grade level. This is like criminal in our country of lots and lots of resources, right? But year after year, we had been placing teachers in New Orleans for 20 years and we weren't seeing anything change. In the last 4 years, the percentage of kids in New Orleans who are meeting state standards has gone from 23% to 48%. I can now go to New Orleans and spend 2 days just walking around schools. I would have thought, if I'd done that 5 years ago, this is a crime scene. Like, seriously, we're just writing off kids' lives. And today I would think I would put my kids in any of these schools. It's just been a revolution. So the first thing I've learned through the Teach for America journey is that truly, you know, this problem that at every turn people think it's just not possible, we really can solve the problem. The second big thing I've learned is that the core of the solution is leadership. in our country, and I've realized this is a global phenomenon, we want to solve this problem tomorrow, and so have you heard the term silver bullet? Like, silver bullet solution, it's like people think, let's do that, that'll solve the problem. Let's give every kid a computer, that will solve the problem. Or let's just change the curriculum. Or let's give parents vouchers, let's just do that. All over the world, and certainly this characterizes our educational leaders in the United States. It's just been this huge lurch from one silver bullet solution to another. You could name every year in the United States for the last 20 years. This was the year of the give every kid a computer, and that was the year of make every school a charter. None of this, it turns out, we haven't seen those things work in and of themselves. So you start looking at what's different in the classrooms where things are really changing in meaningful ways for kids, or in these whole schools that are changing kids' trajectories, or now in the communities, because not every community is making meaningful change, but some of them are. What's different? And the thing that's different is leadership. You think about Aurora, she was an incredible leader. I think about her and I just think, I've never met a more extraordinary leader. Like, she went into her room that most people would have thought seemed pretty hopeless, and she said, you know what, here's the vision. By the end of the year, here's where we'll be. She got the kids on a mission. She was incredibly goal-oriented, and she got her kids where they needed to be. When you spend time in these hundreds of schools, and I've probably spent time in more than 100 of them, and what I realized is they're all about leadership. It's always the school leader who's on a personal mission to change things for kids in that building. And now knowing what happened in New York and New Orleans, what I realized there is that there was a constellation of leaders in those two cities, meaning people working at every level of the education system and at every level of government, who were deeply centered in the lessons that could be learned in those high-performing schools, who knew we don't have to live in the land of incremental change anymore. We can have truly meaningful change for kids, and who understood what it would take to get there. That, the crux of those two ideas, that we can solve this problem and that ultimately it's about leadership, that is the mission of Teach for America, it's the mission of Enseña Chile, it's the mission now of all of the Teach for All programs. In the United States, there are many educational leaders, but Teach for America is sort of an unparalleled source of leadership for change in our most under-resourced communities. So you go to New Orleans as an example, and you realize a quarter of the schools are run by Teach for America alumni as their principals. Our alumni and teachers together are reaching half the kids. The school superintendent, the vast majority of the district leadership, and the leaders of maybe 20 nonprofit organizations that are supporting the change, Teach for America alums. Even in a city as big as New York, you know, more than 100 schools are led by Teach for America alums, including the fastest improving and highest performing of them. And if you walk down to the district, you realize that the heads of every division, I don't think I'm exaggerating, are Teach for America alums. Early education, special education, English as a second language, teacher performance, student assessment, and this unit that manages the portfolio of schools and shuts some down and opens some up each year. So about 5 years ago, I started meeting, maybe it was 7 years ago now, very inspiring people like from us here in Chile, but from all over the world, from really diverse parts of the world, who one way or another had found their way to believe that they needed to take on the problem of educational inequity in their countries. And they were determined to do this by enlisting their country's future leaders in a movement to solve the problem. So essentially they wanted to adapt the Teach for America model, which had also taken off in the UK as Teach First, to their context. And I've had the incredible privilege over the last 5 years of coming to understand their journeys as we have worked to support them through the Teach for All network, a global network of these organizations and a growing network. And I learned one more lesson in the last 5 years. Everything I saw and have seen, and I know Tomas will speak to this in the Chilean context, has reinforced the idea that we can solve this problem. I've met auroras in every country. People who, as teachers, have produced just truly transformational change for their kids. We're starting to see the alumni of these programs go off and exert incredible leadership in ways that have real potential to change, ultimately, whole systems. The other thing that I've learned, and the third, probably biggest lesson of my last 20 years in this, is about the kind of universality of this problem, and therefore the shareability of the solutions. I didn't realize how pervasive the problem of educational inequity is. We all know that there are certain countries that are just much higher need countries than the United States, where this problem exists in huge proportion. But it turns out that in just about every country around the world, even the Koreas and the Japans and the Swedens that we all have these perceptions of, it turns out when you get into the data, your educational background predicts your economic background predicts your educational outcomes. But the other thing we've learned is that the problem looks the same from place to place. The nature of the problem is so similar. And you can imagine why that is. Like if you're a kid and you're facing all the extra challenges of poverty and you show up to schools that weren't designed to meet your extra needs, your reality looks much more similar than it does different from place to place. And we've also seen incredible patterns that exist at the governmental level. And maybe there's something discouraging about realizing that the problem's so similar everywhere. I mean, we must be fighting the forces of gravity. The one thing that gives me hope in that is that you realize the solutions are shareable. So I'm so optimistic today, much more so than I was 5 years ago before I met the Tomases of the world, because now what I'm seeing is these programs magnetizing the most brilliant and deeply committed people all over the world. There's something about this idea that just has a magnetic power. Thousands of people, irrespective of country, who are, channeling their energy to say, we want to be part of this effort. And they're doing that in very diverse cultures that inspire different ways of thinking. And so what I'm realizing is that, you have all this top talent channeling their energy against the same problem in diverse cultures as part of a global network where people are going to be sharing solutions. And you just realize that we're going to see an ever-accelerating pace of change. And I'll just close by saying the biggest driver in Teach for America's work this year, despite its 22 years of experience, are the lessons it's learned from the Teach for All programs, who are often just 2 or 3 or 4 years old. And it's also so encouraging to see the first of those very high-performing schools launching in the hands of third-year alumni in places like Mumbai. You just start realizing, wow, like we will soon have a global movement. And just as I would never have predicted in the United States, 5 years ago, no one would have ever predicted that New Orleans and New York City would be the fastest improving school systems in the country. I mean, no one could have envisioned the level of momentum, and I just know that 5 years from now and 5 years after that, we just can't imagine how quickly the effort to grow educational opportunities all around the world will be, and how fundamental that will prove to be to our overall global welfare. So I'll just close by saying I now firmly believe, 20 years ago, I thought we should do something about a big problem. Today, I know we can. We can realize the vision of providing all kids with the opportunity to attain an excellent education. And to me, there's only one question, and it is a very big question, and that is whether enough of our world's, and in this case, this country's future leaders will actually decide to step up and make that vision a reality. I just know that if you do, we will actually get there. And I can't imagine anything more important or anything more fulfilling to be a part of.